get state laws passed. So those were collectively called Granger laws. All right. So they didn't initially say, I want the federal government to do anything. That would not have been a normal mindset for anybody, hardly. Say, the federal government should fix this problem. So they said what was natural for almost all Americans, state government. I was talking to a student the other day about, this bill that's in Congress, theoretically, to try to make a federal licensing for firearms. And I'm like, it's just not going to happen. It's absolutely going to fail because it's a state issue, and constitutionally. And so that's what they thought. But constitutionally, it turned out it wasn't a state issue, right? It was a federal issue. So when you're talking about some industry that's so big that it operates across state lines, only who has the authority to tamper with that, regulate that, mess with it? Only the federal government. States cannot do anything to a business that is transporting goods across state lines. Now, totally within their state, if that's how it operates, they can do that, right? But unfortunately, they're going to say, we want this thing, like this interstate commerce. So what then is the large answer for the reason for the Industrial Revolution? Okay, the question given in the text is the 6 reasons for why America, particularly, keep in mind, America is going to leap ahead of everybody else during this period. The Brits had been the dominant power. No doubt the Brits were the first at Industrial Revolution, but America is going to grow dramatically during this period. So by the 20th century, we're the greatest industrial power in the world, which is remarkable since we didn't start the 19th century that way. So first of all, lots of cash, lots of capital. So where did this capital come from? Well, it came from the government. People had contracts, rich people had contracts with the government during the Civil War. So that meant lots of money were flowing to make uniforms and flowing to really fund the war. And so that money went into the economy. Secondly, America probably, if I had to be, why America is the greatest country on earth, collectively, the greatest natural resources of any country on earth that are extractable, reasonably extractable. Maybe Russia has us, but gosh, you got to live in Siberia and people do that. So, the point is that we had the best resources in the world. Not only iron ore, they're going to discover petroleum in Pennsylvania. We had bauxite, we had to make aluminum, we had the coke necessary to make steel, an enormous labor supply. That means wages will stay low. That means productivity. You wanted to be good at your job because you were replaceable. But I would put a big star beside number 4. There is one of the major reasons why we are light years ahead of the Chinese. A communist system does not reward inventiveness. And the more socialistic our system of education becomes, the less inventive it'll be. So I do not want that to happen. The beauty of America is we take risks, not that we, settle for what's easy. Americans have gone bankrupt multiple times, and yet been successful. So that's entrepreneurialism, ingenuity, the inventiveness of our people. And I do believe we're the most inventive people on earth and have been for 100 years. Although I'm worried about that because I think we're starting to act like the Spanish in the 1590s, which means not trying very hard anymore. There's a reason why we have shortage of skilled, high-skilled professions, okay, as well as low-skilled professions. The government was pro-business, and I mean pro-business, not laissez-faire. It's called laissez-faire at this period in history, but it ain't laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means they don't do anything. They actually use the government to crush unions, to subsidize corporations and businesses. They did not regulate them, even though they passed laws. But number 6 is this sort of story of the American system that I was telling you earlier. The American system never happened under Henry Clay. But the vision of an internal market that doesn't need imports and doesn't require exports is sort of like a dream, and yet we were able to do that. We probably could do that to a degree now, but we would have to have a major lifestyle change. Because the problem with Americans that we're running into in this post-industrial age is that we want products that are cheap, but we want wages that are high. Well, those two things are non-compatible. You can't do both. So we have to find a way to produce goods and services that value is high enough that wages are high to match that. And that's been the real dilemma of job creators at the government level, is that how do you do that? How do you, we have to export Boeing airplanes. We have to export drugs and stuff like that. But, it's tricky. So during this period, we were able to sell our steel to ourselves. You understand? Sell our iron ore to ourselves. Okay, so who were some of the great inventors? And I don't mean to imply that they're just these guys, but the big two I'm going to focus on in this class are Bell and Edison. And Bell is, going to be, and from our side, we're not going to focus on the technological science of what he did, but rather the outcome of what he did. Now both Bell and Edison were backed by a fellow named J.P. Morgan. They had financing from a guy named J.P. Morgan. So you need to know that these were not wealthy people when they started out. Bell, he was a teacher of the deaf, basically, and he was trying to come up with a device to teach deaf people how to hear. And that's how he landed on this communication device, which is extraordinary. What's interesting, though, is that that Bell, working with J.P. Morgan, would create one of the most successful companies of all time. This was Alexander Graham Bell's company, financed by J.P. Morgan's bank, called the American Telephone and Telegraph Company.
AT&T.
That's right. It sounds like a mouthful, right? So this is the birth of AT&T. Bell's company became AT&T. And this would combine existing telegraph lines. So all of this stuff is flowing out of New York City. This is the home of capital for the United States. Capital meaning wealth. And out of there, you can see, and here's Manhattan, right here where the dot is. And they were using existing telegraph lines. Telegraph lines were built on poles. And so they just put telephone lines on the same poles. Now, early telephones we would consider primitive. They had what were called party lines, which mean everybody on the line could pick up the phone and hear what everybody else was saying, which is kind of not private. But nonetheless, this is instant communication where you could hear a voice over 1,000 miles away. And so that's revolutionary. That's just an extraordinary achievement. And this company will become a hugely successful company, as you probably are aware. The other figure, and the thing about Edison that I give so much credit to is, this is the guy that Tesla worked for briefly. This is the guy who employed lots of smart people. So not only was he brilliant and super gifted, he had a workshop for brilliant people. So he had like an invention workshop. And I think that's just really cool. Like he's got all these smart people in a room together or rooms together, and they're bouncing ideas off each other. They're coming up with the next thing that Americans want. And of course, the big thing Americans wanted was reliable light. Okay, reliable light. And the problem was light. If you go back in American history, when you start, light was candle lit. So candle, made out of fat, rendered fat and stuff. And then you had whale oil, which was smoky and sort of dark, right? Fumy. And then you had kerosene, which was a huge development. This is a refined petroleum product, which we'll get to in a minute. But what Americans wanted was something that was easy as a flip of a switch, enter the light bulb, right? And so this is a huge invention. And of course, what it requires is electricity running to it, And so Edison and Tesla, you may have heard of the War of the Currents, one of the most fascinating battles between entrepreneurs. Tesla believes in this concept of alternating currents, and Edison's like, there's no way you can generate enough power. It's stupid. So he's much more of a direct current guy. And they had this battle. Ultimately, Edison will be backed by J.P. Morgan. And the very first light bulb that turns on in New York City is J.P. Morgan's office. So he's going to get electricity. And they're going to finance a company, and Edison's company is going to become known as General Electric Company. Or you've, of course, heard of GE. So GE will be the first major electric providing company, General Electric. The competitor, which is the fellow whose company invented the air brake, the pneumatic brake, is George Westinghouse's company, who was also a New York-based inventor who Tesla worked with. So you have Westinghouse and GE going at it, and they'll be two of the great American sort of industrial giants, inventive giants. But Edison doesn't just do the light bulb. So I want to go ahead, and when I say Edison, and I'm talking about his success at patenting what Menlo Park is a place in New Jersey. It's a location in New Jersey. He had a workshop factory, basically, where you invented stuff. And so out of New Jersey is going to come the record player, the very first record player. And so this is going to be today we have Spotify and we have iTunes and, we have digital downloads, but this was the very first recording of sound. And so you can imagine how amazing this must have been. I had a student years ago when I used to assign projects, recreate this. This was a wax tube that was it carved on it. When the needle ran over it, it would play the sound. Really fascinating speaker kind of thing. This is the phonograph, which is a record player. LPs have made a comeback. You guys know, like records, like actual records of kind of a niche consumer crowd now. But this was the very first record player. And so, that means people could listen to Beethoven at their house, which was really revolutionary. Another really fascinating device, it really looks bizarre when you see it being operated, is a recorder. This is the dictaphone. You could talk in it and it would record what you said. And so there's the Pope with his dictaphone. You would actually put it, to your mouth, and you would talk and it would record what you were saying. So it was like a tape recorder kind of thing. One of the great things I'm grateful for from Thomas Edison is he invented the motion picture camera. Now, initially, the entire camera and what they filmed were all under one big black sheet called the Black Maria. It was like a big old tent, and that's where you would film. And the earliest of films were just like moving pictures of something, like a horse moving, or moving pictures of one of my favorite first films ever made was Train Arriving in Station. They loved to film trains, like trains arriving. People got a big kick out of that. Like, oh, look, the train's coming. So, in fact, they showed it and they would project these on tents, walls. And in one case, they projected it and the people screamed and ran out because they thought a train was somehow coming through the wall. Like these, what is this monstrosity? So all of these patents that Edison is grinding out, as well as other inventors, everyone was thinking of this. So when you think about the great minds, I really wish somehow we as America could meld Votech with Gov School or Votech with AET, because by that I mean by separating us into academically college-bound tracks and how to make stuff tracks, we're forgetting that those two people should definitely be the same people. You understand? It's no coincidence that Steve Jobs knew how to build computers, not just create programs for them. So this is a period when Votech and Gov School were kind of together. In fact, the applied sciences weren't that important, like physics and chemistry. People weren't paying much attention to that. They were paying attention to this stuff, because this is what made you money. So that led to scores and scores of patents from the U.S. Patent Office. At one point, the Patent Office was going to close because they thought everything that could be invented had been. This is it. We're all out of inventions. I read somewhere the smartphone alone created more patents than the entire Second Industrial Revolution. Like all the apps, because every app is patented. And think about all the millions of potential apps that exist in the world of the smartphone, right? So this was a period when inventiveness inspired inventiveness. Creativity was like, oh, this is I want to build the next best thing. And so people were taking risks, and you talk about I think a lot about that light bulb experiment that he had dozens of guys working on, hundreds of different filament materials. And I've got a quote over here. It says, when you get tired, don't quit, learn to rest, right? If Edison had quit after the 200th filament, then, he wouldn't have gotten it. So I get really frustrated when students want to quit because something's difficult. I'm like, it's how you handle difficulty that's a sign of your character, and it's where you learn from. You learn from your failures to make important conclusions. So millions of patents, ultimately will be developed during this period. So make sure you know these inventors. They were really fantastic. And as far as the thing about these inventions is that they were useful for ordinary Americans. I mean, we liked electricity. Everyone liked having electricity. It was like a beneficial thing at the time, obviously. If only they'd been doing solar back then, that would be really cool. So there are going to be three types of monopolists that we focus on. Okay, three business models, three monopolists. And we're going to start with one of the most famous. And his name is Andrew Carnegie. He's Scottish. He is an actual penniless Scottish immigrant. So this is, when we talk about the American dream, this is the guy, right, who at one point was the richest man in the world in that time. Obviously, we're not talking about all of history. And he was very, very skilled at seeing what the next thing was going to be. Although for a moment he made a mistake, but he quickly recovered. So Carnegie started out in the telegraph office of a Vanderbilt train company. He was working in telegraphs. That was the business of the day. And he was examining like how trains were made and how train trestles, particularly the things that are over ditches and valleys and gorges. And he knew that iron was where the money was. So he began saving up money and he borrowed money to build an ironwork. But he heard of this fella over in England named Henry Bessemer, who had come up with a more strategic way of making metal. See, iron is a porous, brittle, hard, but not very strong metal compared to an alloy called steel. And what Bessemer had done is develop this process where you can make steel out of molten iron. Okay, this is called the Bessemer-Kelly process. But what you do is you melt iron, and it's pretty high temperature. You got a really high temperature to melt iron. And then you put it in this very large bellows, this very large drum or bell looking thing. And then you blast cold air or air through the liquid iron. And what that does is it drives out the impurities of the iron bond. Okay, it's like it takes out the iron's impurities and it allows the chemical makeup of it to become more a better bond, to put it bluntly. And so that's what we call, with the addition of the coke to the iron and the blowing of the cold through it, the air through it, you had this new thing called steel, which was lighter but stronger than iron. And so Carnegie was initially reluctant because people have been making iron since the Iron Age. But when he saw it in action, he was like, "That's what we got to do." So he comes back to America and he does this. So he creates the Carnegie Steel Company. Now you don't have to write all this down. But what you should see here is what is now known as vertical integration. And I'm going to explain that to you in a minute. But vertical integration means he owned where the iron ore came from, so where it came out of the ground. He owned the mills that turned it into molten ore. He owned the furnaces. He owned the companies that made steel. He owned the bridges that were sold to the government. So he owned every level of production. You understand? Now, he didn't own all of every level of production, but he owned so much of each level of production. We call this a vertical monopoly. So I'm going to show you this here. So here is a monopoly, right? And so his monopoly is what we call vertically integrated. Microsoft was sued for this. What happens is you own a key component of every stage of production, which means you don't have to trade with anybody. And you're so strong, you can crush your competitors. So this is called vertical integration. That's the method. And so when you think of Carnegie, I want you to think of his steel company, right? Because from where it comes from extraction to sales, he owned from every stage of production. And that's remarkable in any period in history. So this is what I'm telling you, this is the Carnegie Company. You may recall that there's a labor unrest in 1894, I think it was, at his Homestead steel plant, because wages were low and hours were long, working conditions were terrible, but that's how he maximized his profit. Okay, so we call this vertical integration, right? Every level, like a ladder, he owned a key rung on every stage of the ladder. Okay. And he was extraordinarily successful. On a level at the time unprecedented. He owned a castle in Scotland with I don't know how many thousands of acres. He owned golf courses. He was very, very rich. And we're going to talk about his support of projects later. But he was an interesting guy, to say the least. And because of two things particularly, so steel is going to grow dramatically because of two major industries. One is the railroad industry. And the other is the new development of skyscrapers. So the construction model of building high-rises, skyscrapers like that I-beam you see up there they're sitting on, that's starting in the 1870s and 80s, right after the Great Chicago Fire. So Carnegie's just in time for not only steel production for trains, but also steel production for buildings. And so that's going to make him, and of course, at the turn of the century, steel for cars. So, America was the most dominant steel nation, in history. We are the home of the Pittsburgh Steelers for a reason, and it's only been recently that the Chinese have been producing steel as a major competitor. We've been the top dog for a long, long time. The other major industry of the day was what I just described earlier, and that's petroleum. So when we think of oil, we usually think of like the Middle East, all right? But oil, or in America, we think of like Texas, or maybe Alaska or something. But actually, oil discovery in America, the first oil discovery was in Pennsylvania. And it wasn't hard to discover it because it was in the water. It was like literally you would see it laying around on the ground, like oil. And so it's interesting. I need to make a PowerPoint slide of it. But if you look up Pennsylvania oil wells, you'll see these hillsides in Pennsylvania covered in oil derricks, they're called, and these wells. And it's like, wow, that looks like Texas or Saudi Arabia. But that was Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania. But I was trying to explain like why oil was so successful. So the very first oil industry is this, the kerosene lantern, and kerosene was how America lit itself. So from homes to trains to street lights, you had people who went around every night and lit the lamps, kerosene lights. So natural gas, if you think of it that way, is really clean burning. But kerosene is a refined petroleum. You understand what refined means? You can get all kinds of stuff out of petroleum when you refine it. Plastic is a byproduct of petroleum, part of the refinery process. Now, the electricity that was invented in the light bulb was going to put a crimp on kerosene sales, but it didn't. And of course, because by the 1920s, what's kerosene is going to take place is gasoline. So it's like this guy is not going to miss a beat. He's going to have the world's greatest kerosene business, and as kerosene almost gets hit, bam, let's switch to gas. All right, and that guy's name is John D. Rockefeller. So John D. Rockefeller was by far the wealthiest person in American history. Okay, I needed to compare Bezos, but Bezos I don't think was close. I mean, this guy was worth in today's money approximately $630 billion. All right, yeah, right. And so keep in mind, this is no taxation on wealth, no income tax, no inheritance or estate taxes. So this is all his money, all right? And Rockefeller was based out of, I'm trying to remember where he was originally from. I want to say it was Pennsylvania or Illinois. He was Midwestern initially. And so what happens is he comes in and he's very, and in some ways interesting to me because he sees business very elegantly. He hated competition. He thought competition was destructive, like not very useful. He wanted to not have to compete. He just wanted to be the very, very best. So what he's going to do is not do what Carnegie did. If you know Carnegie, Carnegie's like trying to get a stage of every level of production. But Rockefeller recognized, like, if you just take over every bit of one level of production, then you control the whole industry. So you can pull as much crude oil out of the ground as possible, and it's not worth a dime if you can't refine it. You guys understand? Crude oil is black sludge. It's not worth anything just in raw format, So what he did was took over and created all the refineries. He was in Ohio. All the refineries in America. Literally, like over 90% were his own. And if anyone created something, he would consume it. He would buy it up. So this is called horizontal integration, when you take over every bit of one stage of production. So for him, it was the refinery. He didn't need to extract it. Who cares? Somebody else can literally get their hands dirty, but he was going to make sure that if any oil was turned into kerosene or later into gasoline, it came through his refinery. And so that made him so successful, okay? And we call that horizontal integration. Now, how he got rid of his competitors is he would buy up shares of their company and put his people in charge of their company. Or better yet, he would tell them, I'm going to take over your company or you let me run your company. And so we call this a trust, meaning that the other companies would allow Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, to run their company. They would entrust Standard Oil with the responsibility of their company. So by doing that, he took over virtually every oil company in America. And it was good oil, guys. This is the thing that's so frustrating about being critical of Rockefeller. He put tons of people out of business, but it was cheap, refined kerosene that everybody wanted. and it made it so common. It's why he picked what to be their name. It is the industry standard. It is Standard Oil. Later on, Standard Oil will be broken up. It'll be, the government ultimately will say, you're too big. And one of those companies will be Eastern Standard of New Jersey, SO, and that will later take on a new name when SO gets kind of old, and which is EXXON. So you've probably heard of Exxon, right? Well, Exxon is one of the many baby standards. An amazing company, just extraordinarily powerful. But it comes on at the cost of him buying Congress, buying Washington, buying anybody who stood in his way, buying up newspapers, or anybody who dared to challenge Rockefeller would be consumed by his power. And this is a great cartoon of Standard was often depicted as an octopus with its tentacles everywhere, you know, sort of controlling the narrative you know, if you ever thought about people in charge, like behind, you know, shaded windows, this is one of those guys, like one of those moments. Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller. Now, I love this picture because it tells you at the core why these guys weren't really capitalists, you know, in a sense of they didn't want competition. Capitalism is defined by competition, right? They said it was unnecessary. We make a good product at a low price. Why have competition? So what he would do is destroy competition. And he would put it out of business. And so here you can see, they call this the American Beauty Rose, which is an actual, you know, hybrid rose made in America. And in it, what has he done with his competitors? He's pruned them all away. So what we've discovered in our country's history is we have a love affair with this kind of thing, but we also resent it. I don't know if any of you guys are fans of like Disney, all right, or Star Wars, but you might have noticed that Xfinity doesn't carry the Star Wars Disney Channel, right? And it's because they're competitors. We would rather just have it all in one place, all right? Well, if we put it all in one place, that means one company is going to benefit and everybody else is going to be hurt, right? So you don't see competition too much. But when it happens, you realize, oh, that's why, you know, because they want to compete, right? And so what this guy did was he eliminated competition without any regulation. Now, the third fella is completely different from the other two in a sense that he never really built a company at all. But he is the banker's banker. So this is the third type of monopoly. And this is the type that most Americans look at today and say, oh, I really would dig doing this job. He is the ultimate Wall Street stock trader. Okay. This guy, you remember, this is the guy that bails out the United States government. All right. So his name is J.P. Morgan, J. Pierpont Morgan. And he is absolutely based in New York. He was born rich. He got richer. He had an interesting idea of becoming, in essence, the owner, his bank, the owner of virtually every major company in America, with the exception of Rockefeller and Carnegie. But he wants to own a piece of everything. Okay. And to do this, what he does is he takes members of his bank, right? And he puts them, his employees in essence, on the board of directors of. So if I were to buy, let's say LJ over here owns a company that's publicly traded, you know, traded on Wall Street. And Morgan would buy 40% of the shares of that company. And then he would put, if there was 10 board of directors, 4 directors on that board. But then he would push it even further and make it 5 directors. So what happens is his bank is on all of these different companies' boards of directors. So he's making sure that they don't compete with each other, right? That they work together. And so he is literally creating a global industry of banking ownership, which is so far superior to anything the Medici's ever dreamed of, right? The only person of this period that would be a competitor maybe would be Baron Rothschild in England, you know, the English banker. So he created, when I say created, he used money to create, he didn't actually build it. He created the first billion-dollar corporation in America, and it came over a golf game. So one of his employees was a guy named Charles Schwab. Andrew Schwab. No, Charles Schwab. And Schwab was playing golf with Carnegie at St. Andrews, which is a beautiful golf course in Scotland. And Schwab asked Carnegie how much would he sell Carnegie steel for. Carnegie steel was like extraordinarily expensive, right? And this is what they did. They were playing golf, and he took out a piece of paper and he calculated the value of it, right? And if you look here, you can see he asked $450 million from J.P. Morgan. 450 million. Okay. And Morgan said, that's a good price. I accept this price. So Morgan could cut a check for $450 million to Andrew Carnegie. Right. So they were later on. By the way, JP Morgan owned a part of the Titanic. But they were on a cruise ship together, and the Scottish guy, it says here, this is Andrew Carnegie, said, could I have asked it more for you? And he said, yeah, probably another 100 million, right? There's a guy who can literally on a napkin at a country club write $450 million down and say, yeah, that works. Right? So this is the creation of the first capitalized billion-dollar corporation. When I say capitalized, I mean it's the value of the whole company was valued once it was created out of Carnegie Steel as U.S. Steel. Now, U.S. Steel is still in existence. That's its symbol. And it was created by J.P. Morgan, and it was then worth $1 billion, which is like 30 billion today. Some crazy huge number. So that's how powerful Morgan was. He actually bought out Andrew Carnegie on a golf course napkin. Okay, pretty awesome dude in terms of power. To give you a sense of perspective, this is J.P. Morgan's empire. So I told you, he financed GE. He financed AT&T. He financed the major bridge company in the world, American Bridge. If you come down here, he financed International Harvester, which is going to be one of the great agricultural harvesting machines. He financed this thing, which is the White Star Line. That is the company that made the Titanic, right? JP Morgan sold his shares in it right before Titanic sailed, right? Well, I'm going to rephrase. He didn't sell it. He took out a special insurance premium on it. So what this meant, Morgan was on the ship. He was on Titanic, and it stopped in northern France before it went across the ocean. And he got off with his mistress there, and he left. He didn't ride on the Titanic. And he had a huge insurance clause on it. So he actually made money when the ship sank. Morgan actually got richer because the Titanic went down. In fact, there's some conspiracy theorists who believe that Morgan urged the captain of the Titanic to go fast to break the record with the hopes that it would sink because the ship was losing money. If you ever wonder why poor people were sailing on the Titanic, it's because they were selling their tickets at half price. You understand? Because there were so many ships crossing the Atlantic, it wasn't that big a deal anymore. So anywho, this guy owned at least major shares of enough shares to be controlling interest, we would call this in finance, of all these companies and all these railroads. Here's another way to look at the interlocking directorate of this period. Okay, this is J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller's interlocking directorate. So here you see Standard and Morgan, and they end up between them controlling virtually every major industry in America. Okay, so these are, when we talk about titans of industry, it's on a whole nother level. You understand? I mean, like far beyond anything that we've ever seen in our lifetime. So JP Morgan is usually depicted in cartoons as being much, much bigger than Uncle Sam, right? This is a period where this business titan was far more important than the U.S. government, where all the other politicians and, small businesses followed him like the Pied Piper. So when we talk about the power, the sheer power of wealth, these people were so far above the law that they didn't really think in terms of it anymore. It just wasn't their problem. It was how they interacted. They interacted on their own terms completely. And that's really, really bizarre when you think about that. Like they were their own world. One of the hallmarks of the Gilded Age is Morgan taking over companies. So what that means is we call this mergers. So if you go back to the 80s, or if you look at today, if you look at the recession of 07, you would have companies buying up smaller companies and getting bigger and bigger, right? That's a merger. And so that's a very strong indication of not much regulation, because what it's led to in America, one of the worst things I've ever seen is a concept called too big to fail. We now have businesses that are so big that if they go under, it will pull the entire global economy down. Well, from a regulator's perspective, that's too big to exist. Like there should never be any single company that puts the entire global economy at risk. Yet that's where we are now. And that's why the government has to routinely step in and bail out companies, which is totally anti-capitalist. In fact, there's a term for it in free market capitalist studies called moral hazard. It means business owners expect the government to bail them out. Therefore, they do not nice, smart business decisions. They do riskier decisions because they don't feel a fear of it. And this is a period where they don't care about the government, obviously. I've given you a small example of how this works. So today, the easiest way to look at consolidation and mergers is in the world of media. And so it used to be 50 plus companies owned a good chunk of American media, right? Today, 6 companies own over 90% of it. They bought up all these small media. So what that means is, they're going to have a say in virtually everything you're exposed to. Every book you read is determined by them. Every movie, TV show, with the exception of user-created content on YouTube, right? But even that's starting to become a thing, right? You can see now YouTube and Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, they're becoming more and more similar, aren't they? And they're buying up small companies and taking them over. I think, isn't Instagram owned by Facebook now? Yeah, and so ultimately these companies are just going to consolidate and swallow up all the other ones. And that means less options for you, ultimately, less exposure to other stuff. But they'll argue it's at a better price, right? So this leads to the discussion of what life was like in America during this period. Like what were people thinking of this? Okay, what were they considering this? And the answer is they were not really opposed to this initially at all. There was no strong sentiment of these are bad ideas. Americans were very excited about all this new wealth. When I say Americans, I mean, keep in mind, it really is a story of 2 Americas, at least during this period. Rural South, none of this makes any difference. So everything I'm teaching you, none of it applies to the rural South. All right, so I want to make sure you know that. But in the industrial part of the United States, from New York to Illinois, out on the West Coast a little bit, this was all about individualism. I made this. I did this. Right? The individual. So we celebrated that. And that's part of an ongoing tradition in America. You may recall Emerson's essay. It's called what? Self-reliance, right? So this is while Europe, many European states are beginning to consider socialism. Understand? This is the period where Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. But in America, we, as a part of our democratic values, value the individual. And thus, if the government is interfering with the individual's freedom, then that was non-democratic. That was non-American. Okay? So these folks initially, and I mean at both the corporate level and at the political level, and in many ways at the local, keep in mind, they are being fed a line of this nonstop in things like newspapers, right? So kids are learning this in school. This is it. This is how it works, So they're raised on this. So you get a sort of attitude that's overwhelmingly prevalent, is that the government doesn't really have a role in any of this. So what then you see here is a letter from, now this guy, to be fair, is a labor union leader. Sam Gompers is the founder of the American Federation of Labor, okay, which is the most powerful union even now to American history. And he's talking to a judge here, and keep in mind, judges were bought and sold too. You evidently have observed the growth of corporate wealth and influence. You recognize that wealth, in order to become more highly productive, is concentrated into fewer hands and controlled by directors, representatives, yet you use the siren song, the working man should depend entirely on his effort, his own individual. So in other words, you're poor because it's your fault. All right, you just need to work a little bit harder. So what happens is Carnegie, for example, becomes the example, except he's the exception. Do you understand? So people look at Carnegie and go, oh yeah, that's my story too. When in fact, that's not reality at all. Very few people in America ever became Andrew Carnegie, right? And that's because really that level of the American dream is unattainable for most Americans. Okay, it just is statistically. So it's just like kids growing up wanting to be, football players in the NFL or baseball players. You had the better chance of getting struck by lightning twice than becoming a professional athlete. It's just not realistic. Yet, so many dreams of the American young people. So I have to remind them that the facts don't, bear that out. And this guy's saying there's been a whole lot of individual effort by your workers, and they're not getting any better off at all. They work their living butts off. The school of laissez-faire, which you seem to be a pronounced advocate, has produced great men in advocating the theory of everyone for himself. And his satanic majesty taking the hindermost, but the most pronounced advocates of your school of thought and economics have, when practically put to the test, been compelled to admit the combination of the masses are essential. So here you're having this debate. Where is the value from? Is the value from Carnegie or from the steel workers, right? And the ideal of America is it's Carnegie, it's him. And Gompers is a representative of the workers saying, wait a minute, there would be no Carnegie without the toiling workers, right? And so you have this huge debate begin to happen, particularly because factory workers and miners and mill workers are like, this sucks. We work all the time, and these guys have 14 houses, and I can't afford rent on a company house. So, they're like, this isn't, the way it should be. In fact, wage earners at Gompers and others would warn, if not treated better, will revolt. This is what poor people do in history. They get angry and they storm buildings and shoot people, and so that's what he's saying. I mean, he's not threatening that, but he's saying this is what happens if you just look at it this way. But rich people had an attitude that said, you know what? Let's actually come up with a very cool Christian support of being rich. All right, let's make it even better. It's not enough to be rich because, well, you know what? You're not as cool as I am. Let's make it because God wants me that way. All right. So this becomes known as the gospel of wealth. Okay, the gospel of wealth. And the gospel of wealth said that if you are, and keep in mind, guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan were huge church members, big donors to their individual Christian churches. So they argued that it was a sign of God's approval if you were rich. God must shine on you as keep in mind, this is a huge change from when the Catholic Church in the 1500s had said making profit off of humans is, off of interest or, greed is sinful. So this is a fundamental shift. It's saying, it is a Christian duty to get rich. All right. And you have this minister, Russell Conwell, who's a celebrity, who went around giving this sermon called the Acres of Diamonds sermon. They said it's the poor people's fault they're poor. In fact, you are undermining God's will if you help the poor, i.e. give them money or stuff like that. So shame on them for being poor, right? I mean, the same thing's going on in England at the time. All you got to do is read one Charles Dickens book to know the same attitude. Same thing's going on now. The Acres of Diamonds speech. This is what he said. He delivered this thing 6,000 times. I say that you ought to get rich. It is your duty to get rich. The men who get rich may be the most honest men you find. Let me say here clearly, 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America, he make that up. He told how many are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they are trusted with money. That is why they carry on great enterprises and find plenty of people to work with them. It's because they are honest. I sympathize with the poor, but the number of poor to be sympathized with is very small. To sympathize with the man whom God has punished for his sins is to do wrong. So you're poor because you're sinful, right? Let us remember there is not a poor person in America who was not made poor by his own shortcomings. This is a classic maneuver of blaming the poor for being poor, right? So we're all just supposed to get up off our whats and become Carnegie, all right? Like that's what you're supposed to do. Well, this played really well, and it still plays well. This is an easy parallel to what happened then. It's called prosperity gospel. It's very popular in America today. And it's the idea that God wants you to be rich, right? And so this is the most popular minister in America, guy on the left, okay, Joel Osteen. So, the idea, again, this is, if you believe in this, that's your business. But I'm saying that this is not new. This is something that has been around for a while now. But I did pull this up because it's interesting if you read what Jesus said about it. And I'll let people read this on their own. But what's fascinating to me about Christianity, just as a student of religions, is that it's overwhelmingly critical of rich people. Like everything you read in the Bible is in the New Testament, certainly that Jesus is talking about, is not complimentary of the rich. So it's fascinating to me how that becomes this sort of duality of the narrative. Now I will say this: one of the things that the gospel of wealth advocates believed in was that you did have a duty to help your brethren. Now, what does help mean? Help does not mean welfare. Help does not mean, giving direct relief to poor people. Help means giving charity to things like this. But while Carnegie never helped poor by, like, say, here's a soup kitchen, he endowed more libraries in America than any other person. 2,500 libraries. If you've ever heard of Booker T. Washington, Andrew Carnegie, paid to help establish Tuskegee Institute. All right. He paid for telescopes. He helped found universities. And look at his philosophy. I love his philosophy in a way. To spend the first third of your life getting all the education you can. The next third of your life making all the money you can. And the last third of your life giving it all away. So at least Carnegie's gospel of wealth meant you have like sort of a moral responsibility to sort of govern society better as a rich person. So that's interesting. At least there's this idea that not simply that God wants you to be rich, but that you have a sort of duty that goes with being rich. So this is part of the gospel of wealth too. Not only, were you supposed to be rich, but look, I mean, he gives away $380 million. So if he gets $450 million for his sale, he gives away almost all of that. Or not all of it, but a lot of it, to these wonderful philanthropy. Oh, by the way, philanthropy, that's a term you should learn. Philanthropy, when I give money to causes, it's called charity, right? Because I'm poor or lower middle class or whatever, right? When these guys give money, it's called philanthropy. So philanthropy is charity that gets your name on buildings, right? So if you're ever up at Virginia Tech and you're in the Pamplin School of Business, that School of Business is named for a rich donor, right? So if you're rich enough, they name buildings after you. And if you're really rich enough, they name the whole college after you. All right. So this is what money buys you, right? That's what philanthropy is. It's like super duper rich charity. But hey, it's a lot of money. So here's what, Carnegie says. There remains. So here's Carnegie's own words. Only one mode of using the fortunes we have, right? It's the true antidote for what he says is the temporary unequal distribution. It's temporary. If we give it all away when we're old, then it won't be permanent. Of course, that's not what rich people do. They leave it to their kids. But the way to make up, have harmony between rich and poor, indeed, is not communism, right? Indeed, another ideal differing from communism. So this is like his anti-communist writing. In requiring the further evolution of existing conditions, not the overthrow of civilization. It is founded on the present idea of individualism. And the race is projected to be put in practice by degree when everyone pleases. Under its sway, we shall have an ideal state, right? The surplus wealth of the few will become, in the best sense of the property of the many, because administered for their what? Common good. So in other words, we're the trustees of money. Y'all don't know what to do with it. We're going to be the ones that make the smart decisions with money. Y'all are going to throw it away on lottery tickets or something. All right, we're going to build the world's great industries and found libraries and stuff. What are y'all going to do? Smoke crack? No, or whatever, heroin, whatever the drug was at that time in history. So the point is that they have this sense of we're doing the right thing because the masses shouldn't do it until they're prepared. They're not capable of doing this, right? All right. So the elevation of our race can be distributed in small sums to the people themselves. Even the poorest can see this and agree that great sums gathered by some of their fellow citizens for public purposes from which everybody gets the benefit. So he's like, hey, look, I don't get the benefit of 2,500 libraries. Guess who does? Poor people, right? You're going to be the ones that are going to check out books at the library. I could have my own private library, right? You're going to be the ones that go listen to live music performances, okay? So this is an interesting argument, all right? And he's basically saying if poor people are left to their own devices, they'll just blow all the money, just burn through it. But we'll do something with it. We'll endow great things. So that's his argument, and it's called On Wealth, right? Andrew Carnegie. He's an interesting guy, and he really did do this motto of giving away, pretty much his money at the end of his life. I didn't get into all the details of why he's mean necessarily, but, certainly had some of that too. Now, out of Britain comes an idea that is just as perfectly timed as you could be because it adds science to their argument. So if you recall that back in the 1860s, a fellow named Charles Darwin wrote a book. In fact, he wrote a couple books. And one of those books is called On the Origin of Species, right? The basic premise of On the Origin of Species is that in nature, the strong survive and the weak die off, right? Something like survival of the fittest. And so you had this British economist named Herbert Spencer, and he's definitely one of the great founders of free market economies, who said that this Darwinism. Now, by the way, Charles Darwin never argued this. Charles Darwin was not a social Darwinist. I think it's important to make that note. Charles Darwin was a scientist and a naturalist, but he didn't consider his ideas appropriate for society. You know, so Spencer said the science of Darwin makes perfect sense in humanity. So the people with the most wealth are clearly the fittest, and the people that are poorest are clearly, well, not. All right, you know, and so now you have a sort of economic ideology combined with a business acumen. So that's really and a religious belief. So now you have this sort of it's good to be rich, right? It's going to come to America to this Harvard professor. This is William Graham Sumner. And Sumner is going to give lots of speeches and write books and be a professor. And he says, you know, again, the beauty of capitalism is everyone can rise or fall on their own. Everyone should have freedom to fail. Now, I say that as a teacher. You should have the freedom to fail. If you choose not to work, you should not be given something that society says other people have to work for. I do believe that philosophically. But I also believe that if you are disabled or if you're impoverished, then you're facing real, you know, I'll put it this way. I purposely rejected trying to be rich in my life. Okay. But I have a graduate degree, you know, I have an undergraduate and a graduate degree. My wife has a graduate degree. So my children are being raised by two middle-class educated parents, right? The probability of them being successful is very high. So I would say that's not even starting point. It's like if we're running a race, my kids are starting ahead of kids who aren't that fortunate. Now, of course, my kids can't go to a private elite institution and be tutored, right? And travel all over the world and see everything that's possible that the wealthiest can have. So they have an advantage. But at very least, America can offer equality of opportunity, meaning once you come in this room, I'm not going to discriminate against you, regardless of who you are. But Sumner is saying state intervention is wrong. So the creed of the American economic attitude is don't interfere with business. This is why the Interstate Commerce Act is so hard to get passed. This is why the Sherman Antitrust Act is hard. In other words, the American public are slow to see a change of we should start looking at businesses. Okay, so here's Sumner. Competition is the law of nature. So keep in mind, social Darwinism is like a scientific philosophy. I would argue it's pseudoscientific, meaning what it does is it only looks at one side of the narrative. It's like, let's look at this group, but it doesn't really consider why the conditions that create this group exist. So it's like, okay, you know, that's natural selection. It would be like if we polluted all the water and said, oh, look, the fish all died because of nature. You know, that's not quite the way it works, right? You know, but nonetheless, competition, he says, is a law of nature. Now, think about that. What if I said there are 19 grades in this class? And whoever has the best one gets that one. And whoever has the next best one gets that one. So when we talk about competition, people are like, yeah, it's all about competition until, oh, what if only one person can succeed, right? Sort of the Ricky Bobby philosophy, right? If not first, you're last. Like, what if that was what we would do, right? So that's not really the law of nature, you know, because you have lots of critters that survive in nature, you know, so to speak. But anyway, he says nature is neutral. She submits to him who energetically attacks her, assails her. She gives her reward to the fittest without any regard or consideration. That's nature. We do not like it and we try to amend it. There's only way in which we can do it. We can take from the better and give to the worse. So here you have it. Rich people are better, poor people are worse. You understand? And that is really the philosophy that comes out of this, is that it's always the poor people's fault they're poor. Rich people would never rig the system, right? It wouldn't make it possible where it's very hard to move up. All right. And let it be understood that we cannot go outside of this. So he's trying to argue a scientific reason for why the wealthy people are wealthy. Okay, so you have a moral religious reason, right? Gospel of wealth. You have a scientific reason. And that's great. You know, I mean, that's certainly made it justifiable to these folks. Now, I will tell you again that American culture also celebrated this. I need you to write this guy's name down, know about him. It's not really a chapter on writing, but you'll read his name a little bit later on too. There's a guy who's one of the most popular written work ever in American history. His name's Horatio Alger. Horatio Alger wrote really great youth stories, books for young people, particularly young boys. And in it, it was sort of like Boy Scout books almost. It rewarded virtuous young people who good behavior and upright in morals, and they usually got the girlfriend or rescued somebody or got a good job. In other words, you would succeed by being this good person, and so that was really what a lot of kids read, and many kids admired that, and I admire the idea that if you work hard and you are industrious and smart, that you can go far in this world. Like I said, I just started this class off with a former student who's now a PhD holder in genetics and has some awesome research job. And she comes from a family who has no college background. So you definitely can do that, but it is challenging, right? It is very, very difficult. So Horatio Alger is going to make this concept of the self-made man a very strong concept, right? And I fundamentally disagree with it. The idea that we're solely self-made. I think I have a lot of credit to give to my teachers along the way, to people who sacrificed for me. I think we do a lot on our own, but I think that we do it as a society. I don't think we're all a nation of individuals. Yes, we have strong individualism, but it's not this great. So anyway, no Horatio Alger. So what seems to be the proper term for what emerges in America during this period is really what one historian calls manufactured consent. So what that means is, as long as people don't really pay attention to the people in power that much, they'll keep voting, right? But in reality, the people in power keep running the show. This is called a plutocracy, which means a rule by the wealthy. In other words, these rich people are, keep in mind, this is a period when they're threatening to fire you if you don't vote a certain way, right? And they know how you vote because you vote in public. It's a public action. So voting was really sort of rigged to a degree, to use it bluntly. And then you're going to have an extraordinary development. And it's one that to this day I kind of scratch my head at. So you guys recall the 14th Amendment, right? So the 14th Amendment was, most famous for it granted civil rights to citizens, meaning people born in America. So think African Americans, they had civil rights now, they're free from discrimination from their state. But in the wording of the 14th Amendment, it says no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. Okay, well, that seems reasonable. That's in the Fifth Amendment. It says the Congress can't do that. So why does that have anything to do with corporations? Well, to quote Mitt Romney, corporations are people. That's the Supreme Court, and it's still the law of the land. Because who makes up corporations? Who owns the shares of corporations? People do. Now, I would argue that if I can't murder a corporation, it's not a person. If some lady can't have an abortion of a corporation, it's not a person, right? But currently, now there are a lot of people, some of them are Bernie Sanders types, who want to see this ruling changed. It's called corporate personhood. So I'd like you to know this case. The case is called Santa Clara. It actually happens at the same time as the Wabash case. Remember the Wabash case? Now, I'm not exactly sure why your book doesn't teach you this, unless your corporate overlords didn't want you to know. I'm just kidding. But the point is that as far back as the 1880s, the Supreme Court ruled that because corporations are owned by people, they cannot have their property, right? Look back at the 14th Amendment. Property or liberty deprived without a due process, meaning you can't just take away stuff from corporations or regulate. This is extraordinary. By the way, this has been expanded. Corporations now have free speech, and corporations, at least some, have freedom of religion to discriminate. Hobby Lobby, most notably, a case called Hobby Lobby. All right. So the point is that corporate personhood is very real and has been for 130 years. So whenever a state considers regulating a business, they have to do it in such a dramatic method that it's very hard for them to do. It's very hard for states to do. They have to show a compelling interest, and that means they have to go to court. Now, you guys might be familiar with these things like Mountain Valley Pipeline and these various pipelines, right? Well, the reason they're being dragged out in court is because states are trying to stop them, and the states are losing. Okay, so this was a huge moment for corporations when they made this. It started with railroads, but really all corporations now are considered people. under the 14th Amendment. So that's very, very interesting. In fact, some people think the guys that helped draft the 14th Amendment, some of the lawyers on it were railroad lawyers. And they worded it literally with the intent of using it for this purpose. Santa Clara is a neat case, to say the least. There are going to be so many wonderful cartoons from this period history. One of the great magazines of the period is called Puck, P-U-C-K magazine. Of course, you had Harper's Weekly. We talked about Thomas Nast already. But here you can see this sort of float. Here's Jay Gould, Cyrus Field, who built the first cable across the Atlantic Ocean, Cornelius Vanderbilt. And they're held up afloat by all the labor of the unwashed masses, right? Here's another example of corruption. These are the so-called bosses of the Senate. One of the reasons why the populists and the Grange want the general public to be able to elect senators is that senators, up until the point of the 17th Amendment, were chosen by state legislatures, which were dominated by whatever corporations were in those states. You understand? So that's why the Senate was practically an echo chamber for the trusts. You know, and we've had senators who are so reflective of the corporate interests of their state that they'll be nicknamed like the senator from bowling. You understand? Before Joe Biden was president of the United States and vice president of the United States, he was a U.S. senator from Delaware for a very long time. Delaware has the most lax regulations on credit cards. And so it's the credit card state. And they absolutely back Joe Biden. You understand? So, yeah, the Senate's very much a reflection of the interests of the businesses of those states. Here you have another comparison of the ancient feudal knights and robber barons to the contemporary robber barons, right? By the way, these guys know how to avoid paying taxes altogether, while these guys were being smothered with taxes, right? So the phrase robber baron means, it comes from the medieval age. So during the medieval age, you had a thing called rack renting, for example, where under feudalism, most people, let's say the vast majority of Europeans, did not own anything. They lived on land that was owned by a baron, a landlord, like a barony. And what would frequently happen is the landlord would charge so much in labor, let's call it produce, like let's say they're growing wheat, that you couldn't really afford to live. Like you were being robbed of your existence, basically. That's why life expectancies were short. That's why people had no. That's why land was so important for people who migrated to America. So these people were basically surviving. And guys, I think I told you guys about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Have we talked about that? Yeah. The pyramid that shows. Well, if you can't get beyond the survival level, then there's not much else. There's none of that creativity. There's not sending your kid to college. There's not going to Disney World. Right? None of that stuff. You're just surviving from week to week. Maybe you've heard in America, people living from paycheck to paycheck, right? No savings. Well, that's very real. And it was very real then because these people had nothing. And the government was the product of the wealthy. Okay? So the ultimate outcome of that is a law. They finally passed a law. This is the same time that the McKinley tariff is passed. So let's not think for a minute that this law was meant to be serious. But it is enormously important because you got to have a baby step. You got to have the first step. This is the Sherman Antitrust Act. All right, at least parts of it. The word antitrust means any, and here's the key line right here, any combination or conspiracy to restrain trade is illegal. So that would mean JP Morgan's entire setup is illegal, right? But they don't use the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after corporations. Guess who they target? Labor unions. They say labor unions are acting in restraint of trade. So they pass a law that says antitrust in it, right? And then they go after the very people who wanted the law passed. This would be like passing a law called the Clean Air Act, which allows for increased pollution, right? So, but it is key because later on, you will have presidents and Congresses who will start using this law, most notably Theodore Roosevelt, right? And by the way, the Sherman Antitrust Act is what was used to sue successfully Microsoft. The Sherman Antitrust Act is what is used to break up AT&T. So this is going to one day be a successful bill, right? And the law stays on the books, still on the books. Today, it's still on the books. This is still American law, all right? But when it was first created, it was not used to target trust. It was actually used to target Eugene Debs and the Pullman strike. All right. So again, it's like a rigged game, right? If you're a worker bee in America, a worker soul, you're without luck. You're literally the courts, the Congress, everybody is against you. Okay. Now we're going to close today with the fact that there was some Southern industry. Not much. The one major Southern industry that emerges first is in hand-rolled cigarettes that become machine-rolled. So for years, tobacco had been relatively, let's say, flatline, right, plateaued. But in the late 1800s, a fellow named James Buchanan Duke invests in machinery that will make cigarettes themselves, the machine will. And that way they can produce tens of thousands of uniform length and width cigarettes, which can then be packaged and sold to the public. So his company becomes the American Tobacco Company. And the very first cigarettes that they pioneered were called Lucky Strikes. I'm not selling this as an ad. I'm just saying, if you've ever been to Durham, you've probably seen this outside the ballpark there, right? If you go down and watch the Durham Bulls play, you'll see this right there with downtown Durham. That's because the headquarters of the American Tobacco Company was in Durham. When Duke leaves his endowment, he leaves it to a local small college called Trinity College. That college, of course, becomes the extraordinarily successful college, Duke University. So Duke University was funded, endowed by a cigarette manufacturer. I always think that's ironic whenever I'm down there at their cardio wing. All right, because the best cardiopulmonary hospital around was founded by tobacco, right? Right, you got to get them. You got to get them in the door somehow, right? So yeah, but nonetheless, this will become a huge industry in Winston-Salem. You have R.J. Reynolds here in Richmond, Virginia. You'll have Philip Morris, and so the tobacco industry will get a huge reboot. All right, because before this, it was mostly plugs of tobacco, which is like chew, like a big brick. Or snuff, which is like people would literally snuff tobacco up their nose. It's kind of crazy sounding. The problem, though, as Henry Grady will point out, the South does not have industry. Tobacco being the exception. Henry Grady is author of what we call the New South, which is, by the way, he envisioned Atlanta as what Atlanta is today, which is a hugely successful industrial city, right? I mean, you think about Atlanta today, it's kind of think about like Delta Airlines hub is in Atlanta. It's a great city. And that's what he wanted 100 years ago. The problem is that Southerners weren't doing that. There were no Southern entrepreneurs, hardly. Nobody was building factories. And then when they did do it, they would be stopped by the Northern industry. This is really fascinating when you get to this. But here's one of Grady's great lines. He's writing in Georgia. I once went to a funeral in Pickens County where they buried him in the heart of the pine forest, but the pine coffin was brought from Cincinnati. They buried him within arm's reach of an iron mine, but the nails and the shovel were from Pittsburgh. The South didn't furnish anything on earth for that funeral but the corpse and the hole in the ground. There they put him away, and the dirt rained down on his coffin. They buried him in a New York coat with Boston shoes and pants from Chicago and a shirt from Cincinnati, leaving him nothing to carry to the next world to remind him of his own country in which he lived, which he fought for 4 years, with the chill of blood in his veins and the marrow in his bones. So Grady wants the South to industrialize, but it doesn't during this period. Only a handful. And here's an example of why. It's called Pittsburgh Plus. So down in Birmingham, Alabama, they make steel today. But back then, when they tried to make steel, Carnegie put them out of business. Because what Carnegie did with the rail lines is say any steel in America had to be shipped as if it were from Pittsburgh. So if you were shipping from Birmingham to Atlanta, it would be charged by your railroad like you'd shipped it from Pittsburgh. Well, that put them out of business. They called it Pittsburgh Plus, no matter where it came from. And so that didn't really take off. Thank you, Carnegie. But one industry finally started to evolve, and this is where we're going to close today, because it's right here in River City. Finally, textiles will start coming southward. Cheap, no taxes hardly, and no unions. And so Dan River Mills will be established during this period. I'll pick up with this tomorrow. Y'all have a great day, and hopefully we won't get too much harsh weather. Take care.